Hi, I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. Today I had a phone call from somebody who reminded me just how many of my customers have difficulty finding their queens. And so I said, okay, I will do a video today about finding the queen. And the main reason that it's important to find the queen is to get your mite samples done. So many folks use the reason I couldn't find the queen, so I didn't do a mite check, as a reason not to treat for mites. And that is a big mistake. Now, certainly what you should do is have a fallback position. And that's going to vary from one location to the next location. And what I mean by a fallback position is you want to know when local beekeepers are normally starting their mite treatment regime. Because if you're still not confident with sampling or finding the queen and not getting samples done sufficiently frequently, you should have a fallback position where you know most people are treating for mites now, therefore I better be treating for mites, even though I didn't do a sample. Because for me, it's far more important to get that treatment in than for you to do your sample. But it is by far better to be able to sample before you do a treatment, to say this hive and this apiary therefore needs treating, do your treatment, and then sample again afterwards to check that that the treatments seem to have worked pretty well. But to do that, you need to be able to find the queen, or to do it with confidence, you need to be able to find the queen at any rate. If I was to say when locally I would be doing my first mite treatment, it would typically be around the end of July. Now that's for mid-coast Maine or Bangor area. And basically I can tell you from multiple years of sampling that most of my apiaries will have sufficient levels of mites in one or two of those hives that require mite treatments by about the last week of July, maybe the second to last week of July. Far better to do your own sampling, but this will vary from one location to another. So ask local beekeepers. If you're struggling to do sampling, ask local beekeepers when do they normally do their mite treatments. And of course you can have a lot of different answers, but listen to the folks whose bees live, not necessarily the folks whose bees die. And so today I'm going to show you how I would go about improving your chances of finding the queen so that you can do your mite sampling. And finding the queen leads to a whole lot of other manipulations that you are able to do if you can find that queen. So let's have a look at how we'd go about finding the queen. So finding the queen in a hive can be tricky, but what will really help is to narrow down your search. So first of all, there are certain places in the hive where you're much more likely to find the queen than in other places in the hive. Now, it's true that the queen can be anywhere in the hive, but we're not necessarily looking to say, I'm going into the hive and I have to find the queen that day. Think of it this way, if you've got 2 hives, or 3 hives, or 4 hives, if you're going into the hives, it's the hive that you find the queen in that you should do your sample in. Let's look inside a hive, and I'm gonna do a lot more of these videos when I've got out there in warmer weather, but this is just so you can plan your time perhaps a little bit better and know that you're going to be able to sample for and find your queen in your colony. So let's just take a typical 10 frame colony, and we're going to look at bigger ones as well. And your cluster in the hive is going to occupy, let's say, the majority of space. It's pretty full of bees. The typical layout in a colony will be that bees will have brood in the middle, and remember the queen will start in the middle and work her way out, and as bees emerge from the middle she will start to lay in there and work her way out. So the queen can be anywhere in those areas where she can lay eggs. Around that cluster of bees, the bees will store pollen, and around the pollen they'll store honey. They'll store it on the sides, they'll store it on the top. So if we look at a hive like this where we have 10 frames, honey will tend to be stored on the outside. So if we look in a box like this where we have 10 frames, honey will tend to be stored on the outer frames, and the brood is going to be in the middle, and pollen will be between the brood and the honey. And so, just pretending that we've got bees in here in a typical layout, if we open up look at our first comb, typically that's either going to be foundation or it's going to have drawn comb with honey in it. The queen is very unlikely to be on a frame of just foundation, and the queen is also very unlikely to be on a frame of just honey. So if you look in there and all you can see is liquid in the combs or capped honey, chances of finding the queen on that frame are extremely remote. So we immediately can just spend very little time looking for the queen on that frame. Very high probability that the frame next in line, if it's not full of honey, will be full of pollen and maybe some brood. So it may have honey on this side and honey and pollen on this side. Usually the most pollen will face wherever the brood is. So I would say in most colonies you're going to find that you've got a bit of honey on this side and you're going to have pollen on this side. Maybe a tiny bit of brood there. But because there's so little brood there, chances are we're not going to have to spend much time looking for the queen. Certainly the side with the honey on, we can have a quick look there, but it's unlikely to be on the honey side. It's a little more likely to be on the side with the pollen because that's going to be facing the brood. So you have a quick look in there. Now, this would be the first frame with brood in it. And in all probability, it's going to mirror the same things on the other side. So if we move things along here, this frame is likely to be pretty full of honey, and this frame is likely to be full of honey and pollen. So a very good chance she's not on those two frames either. That only leaves us with another 6 combs to go through in your typical brood chamber. So we can look, and what we're going to find in these 6 combs, remember, from the time the queen lays the egg to the time the larva is pupating, it takes 9 days. And it's going to take from day 10 to day 21 to be as a pupating larva. So roughly half of these combs are going to be full of capped brood, and half of the combs are going to be full of open brood. Actually, it's going to be a little bit more capped brood than you have open brood, assuming a continuous sequence of laying. A frame that's full of capped brood is again unlikely to have the queen on it because the queen can't lay. If the frame is full of capped brood, particularly if it's full of capped brood on both sides, there's nowhere for the queen to lay, except with a little bit around the tiny edges here. Then these are combs where we're less likely to find the queen as well. And that's roughly half of these frames. So really our main search is going to come down to about 3 or 4 frames of bees where we're most likely to find the queen. So let's say this was full of capped brood. And this frame was full of capped brood, but the middle of it, a good portion of brood had emerged, and the bees were emerging from around here, leaving open cells here. Now this is a prime place to look for the queen. Where you've got a lot of emerged brood in the middle, this is the area that the queen comes back to refill the eggs. This is the most recently vacated cells. So this is the place where I would really concentrate my effort looking for the queen, even though there's capped brood around here. And usually the other side of the frame is going to be quite similar. So I'll concentrate on looking for the queen where I've got recently emerged brood. Let's assume we didn't find her here either, but that's where we would concentrate our efforts. Now let's assume this is a frame full of open larvae. relatively little capped brood, maybe a little bit in the middle or something like that, and then lots of younger brood around here. Again, this is the sort of place where the queen is most likely to be, where there's lots of open brood and probably lots of open cells still for her to be laying in. And so we'll spend a lot of time looking in this frame here. Let's assume we didn't find her. Usually one side mirrors the other, and so let's assume here that we again had a frame of capped brood here, but lots of emerging brood in the middle. And so we're going to spend a lot of time looking on this frame because there's lots of emerging brood here, lots of space for the queen to lay. This is a sort of place where we really want to spend time looking for the queen. Another peculiar thing about the queen is if your frame is full of bees here, the queen doesn't necessarily just stay still with a circle of bees around her, though sometimes that's the case. But she'll often be trying to find the darkness again. She'll be trying to get back into the dark. And so she'll be running across the comb relatively moving quickly. And the funny thing about it is, as she moves across the comb, it kind of leaves a wake of the bees move apart as she goes through. And sometimes you can actually see this wake that the bees have moved from one side to the other, a little trail where the queen is. Other things that help you look for the queen, looking for the dark thorax with the hairless back that she has, and of course the large abdomen, which is roughly twice the size of a worker's abdomen. But again, let's assume we couldn't find the queen here. Now again, mirror image, we're quite likely to find a frame full of capped brood. Capped brood on both sides. We're unlikely to find the queen in a frame of capped brood. And let's say, okay, maybe there's another frame of capped brood here. We look through, and gradually we look through the hive and we find a frame of pollen, and we don't see the queen on the frames of pollen and honey here. And this outside frame is likely to be all honey. We're very unlikely to find the queen here. So let's assume we've got all the way to the end here and we still didn't find the queen. Well, what I would do is go through it one more time, but only one more time, going through the frames again. Honey, not likely to be there. Pollen and honey, less likely to be there, still less likely to be there. A frame of capped brood, a little more likely for it to be in a frame of capped brood, but we didn't find it here. Another frame of capped brood, still not very likely to find her on the frame of capped brood, but we might. And this was a frame of emerging brood with the queen, and hey presto, we'll probably find her on our second time through. But let's work on the assumption that we didn't find her. Okay, so we go through and we check each of these combs as we go through, and we work our way through, and we're careful about it. We have a look, always keeping the frame over the hive in case she drops off. And we didn't find her, and there we go. Oh God, we didn't find her again. Let's check everything. In all probability, with a single story hive like this, the chances are we will have found the queen in those 3 or 4 frames where there was lots of space for the queen to lay. I say, okay, well, maybe the next time you'll find it, but the process that you used is really going to maximize your chances of finding the queen. Now, let's look what we would do in a bigger hive. Now, in a bigger colony, we've got a lot more space, a lot more bees, so our chances of finding the queen are significantly reduced. But we go through exactly the same process. But what I would do is work from a different, in a pattern, which is not going to make it harder to find the queen. I'll take the top off and I'm going to put it over here, upside down, and I've got a customer, so I'm going to have to stop. But here's some shortcuts to make sure that you don't waste a lot of effort. So we'll take our cover and we're going to use that as a base, and take our inner cover off, and that can go off for the time being as well. We don't want to start working from the top and going through frames at the top, because if we do, it'll chase the bees down below. A lot of the bees are going to retreat, and that will make this box really full of bees and make it really hard to find the queen. So the best thing to do is separate the two boxes, and now the half of the bees in here, half the bees in here. And now we work our way through these frames. And again, depending on the time of year, there'll be either more brood or more honey. Let's say we're talking about mid-July, time of year when we expect to have quite a bit of brood and quite a bit of honey. So in the lower brood chamber, again, you're very likely to find the outside two frames full of honey. Maybe the outside two, one on each side. So there could be 4 frames that are full of honey. Certainly, you're very likely to have, if it's not full of honey, full of pollen here. So again, we're only talking about going through probably 6 frames here. And just like in the last box, there's probably half of them is open brood and half of it is capped brood. A bit more, it's more like 40-60. So just like we did with the last one, work your way through the box and examine both sides, concentrating on the frames with open brood. And let's assume you've worked your way through. We haven't found it, so work your way back through. We still didn't find it. So we go to the upper story, and we're likely to find exactly the same sort of pattern. Now, if it was full of bees from side to side, we probably already had a honey super on. Let's assume that we didn't have a honey super on. If you have a honey super that's just full of honey, the queen is very unlikely to be in a honey super which just has honey in it. Especially if there's a queen excluder there, then of course there is no queen above that queen excluder. But even a honey super, if it's got open space, you'll want to go through that too, just in case. But let's assume that either you had a queen excluder on or your honey super is partially filled with honey, and therefore we don't have to worry about that. If there was a honey super, we can put it to one side because the queen was very unlikely to be there. So just like this box, we go through this one and we check. We're more likely to find a bigger amount of honey on the outer edges in this box because they're already starting to fill up with honey. So chances are 2 frames of honey and a frame of pollen, and 2 frames of honey and a frame of pollen where the queen is not likely to be, and we've got 4 frames here which have got brood in them. Probably 1 or 2 of them have open brood, and let's assume that we've been through all of them once, we've been through them twice, and I would say that by the time you've gone through a couple of hives in the way I've described, you're going to find the queen. But let's assume we didn't find the queen. So what we know is we have brood in this box, we've got brood in this box. So we still don't know whether we can sample the bees to do a mite check or not, because we don't want to risk harming the queen. So let's do something a bit different. What we're going to do is we're going to use a 3rd box. We need a 3rd box here. Let's check to see that that's in the picture. And with the 3rd box, what we're going to do is we're going to go through this box one more time, again, looking for the queen. Now, ideally, you can use a shallow super or another super here as a funnel, but I'm going to do without it. I'm just going to show you what I want to do here. We take our frame out full of honey, and any bees on there, we shake off. And we make sure that all the bees are off this, or at least if there's a bee or 2 left, we know for sure, having a close look, she's not the queen. And we're going to put it here. So we did this in a video the other day about using a Snellgrove board or a double screen board. So I'm going to be kind of repeating myself here. But we take the bees, shake them off. We're looking for the queen, of course. These were the ones that were full of honey. This one would probably have been full of pollen. We're going to have another look before we shake the bees off. Okay, didn't find her there. Now we're into the brood, so we're going to concentrate a little bit more time here. Didn't find any queen. And we're going to work our way through, checking for the queen. It's not there. Concentrating on the frames where there's open space for the queen to lay. No queen there. And in our head we're thinking, yeah, the queen's probably down here already. We missed her. I'm pretty sure she's not in here. But if you find the queen, great. So, no queen there. Now, if you did find the queen, you can go put her to one side and you know she's not in here, so you can do your mite sample here. But let's assume that we can't find the queen, so we're just shaking the bees in there and we go through this whole box and we didn't find the queen. So now we've got a box full of honey, pollen and brood and no queen, and in here we have a box full of bees with honey, pollen and brood, but we know the queen is in here. The reason we know that is because we know she's not there, so the only place she can be is here. So now we take a queen excluder, we put that on top, and we take our empty super here and we just close it up. And what's going to happen now, you should probably have made sure there's no queen in here as well and shaken any possible queen into that box too before you finish up. So now what's going to happen is, we know there's open brood upstairs here. Bees are going to move upstairs through that queen excluder very rapidly in order to cover up that brood. Now, it would only take a couple of hours and the population of bees is going to have equalized in here again. So now you can go back in the hive with no fear of sampling using the queen, because now we can go in here. This is, say, 2 hours have passed, or the next day has come. It's probably a good idea to do this the next day, because you've shaken the bees up so much, they're going to be a little bit ticked off. So you're better off going in here the next day, everybody's calm and happy again, right? So now we know there's brood up here, there's full of bees up here, and we know that amongst this open brood here, we've got young nurse bees. Those young nurse bees are the ones that we particularly want to sample because they're the ones that have most recently emerged and they have the most recent representation of what mites are like in the brood. So those are the bees we really want to sample, and we get our mite check equipment, which is over here, and we go through here, we find our frame of open brood, and we use our tub and we do our mite sample now with no fear at all of the queen being sampled. We do our mite check and we decide whether or not we need to treat. And remember, if we're doing a sample of half a scoop of bees, half a cup of bees is 300 bee sample. If we have 6 mites or more in a 300 bee sample, it's time to treat for mites. So refer back to some of the mite treating videos, but this is how you can find the queen, or at least eliminate any chance of sampling the queen. And so therefore, there's no excuse not to sample, at least during the time of year when it's convenient to go in the hive and it's okay to go in the hive. I would not be doing this in October when the bees are really defensive. I would be doing my sample in October when I thought I needed to do my sample in October, because there's no point in shaking the heck out of a load of bees that you know need treating, and you know they're going to be very defensive in October here in Maine. And I don't want to have I don't go through every frame in the hive in October. I want it getting ready for winter at that stage. So certainly May, June, July, August, maybe September, well, yes, September, I would be doing sampling like that. And if I needed to, use a queen excluder to separate them. Now, before you close up the hive, you're going to make sure that queen excluder comes off, because you want everything to be back to normal. And now the queen is free to move up and down within the colony. Now remember, you don't have to sample every single hive in your apiary. If you've got 4 colonies in your apiary, or 6 colonies in your apiary, and one of those colonies says, I have 6 mites per 300 bees in your sample, it's time to treat the whole apiary. So if you've managed to sample, let's say 2 of those hives, and one had 2 mites, one had 3 mites, you don't have to sample the rest of the apiary. You've got a ballpark idea. But if one had 2 mites, one had 7 mites, it's time to treat the whole apiary. So try and get a representative sample. Somebody with maybe 20 hives in their yard will typically sample 4, 5, maybe 6 of their hives to get a representative sample of what the mite levels are like. If you're floating around that 5 or 6 mark, it's probably time to treat. I wouldn't leave it until you're definitely exceeding the levels, because you're going to work on the assumption that if you've taken some samples, you've got 1 or 2 above and 1 or 2 below those samples as an average. The sampling for mites is a really essential tool to get your mite treatments exactly right. Now remember, there's always the fallback position of having a schedule, which you know over years of sampling can be relied upon locally as a time where you're most likely to need sampling, but it's most likely to need treatments, But sampling will confirm that and really fine-tune your mite treatment regime. It really is an important tool. Also, using that queen excluder to separate the queen from young bees in the hive can be useful, as we've seen in other videos, and we will see multiple times this year how useful that trick can be. I hope you found that useful. I hope you'll be more confident in finding your queen now, even without the queen excluder, just in the terms of looking through, really only concentrating on 30%, 40% of the frames in the hive. If you've been spending a lot of time looking on frames of honey and frames of capped brood, you could have put that time into looking on frames of open brood, and you're much more likely to find the queen. During the summer and later in the spring, there will be times I can open the hive and I can show you in much more detail, and it'll be easier. The more you do it, the more likely you are to be successful. And also the smaller the hive you do it with, the more likely you are to be successful. So start early in the spring while the hives are small. You're much more likely to find the queen under those conditions. Once your confidence is up, chances of you finding the queen in the bigger hives is much better. I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. See you next time.